Let's talk about climate change, because tomorrow the government will announce updated plans on how it hopes to achieve net zero. Some of this morning's newspapers are previewing that report. Let's have a look at the Yorkshire Post. A Green Day drive to achieve net zero. Carbon capture plans could benefit Yorkshire industry. We're going to welcome Phoebe Plummer from Just Stop Oil. We'll come to you, Phoebe, in just a moment. First of all, Matt, the Yorkshire Post mentions carbon capture, a process to reduce the release of carbon dioxide when burning fossil fuels. That indicates that oil and gas isn't going away anytime soon. Why not?
You know what? We've got a really... I know it doesn't sell papers, and I know it might not even be good broadcasting material, but actually we've got a hell of a good record on the environment. We are decarbonising faster than anyone else in the G7. We were the first major economy to legislate net zero.
That's certainly what climate scientists and even members of the Conservative Party are saying, like your colleague Chris Skidmore. It's halted, it's stalled that process.
We have the world's leading offshore wind sector, and actually the challenges of today are not just about group. We've got to do everything we can to be responsible with our climate, but we've also got other priorities. And actually, we've got to make it work where it works. In my part of the world, we are about to build one of the world's biggest factories, creating 2,250 jobs, creating monopiles for that world-leading offshore wind sector. We're doing a hell of a lot on this front, and we've got a really proud record.
All right, well, Phoebe, I've introduced you. What do you think of the record as set out by Matt?
Hi, thank you so much for having me on. As you say, I'm Phoebe, I'm 21, I'm from London and a supporter of Just Stop Oil. We are demanding that the UK government immediately halts all new fossil fuel licences, and any less than that that's announced on Friday is a complete failure and a betrayal of me and my generation. And I think it's clear that we are not leaders in energy policy. We are going back to the dark ages with our energy, opening up a new coal mine. The government is looking to approve the Rosebank oil field. It's continuing to drill for new oil and gas is an act of genocide, and the government knows it.
Right, an act of genocide for drilling gas and oil, any new licences, Matt?
In 2010, we were taking about 7% of our energy supply from renewables. We're now taking 40%. We've made massive strides forward. We're leading the world in this debate, in this issue. And I think we're making massive strides forward. But we've also got to consider what the people at home consider. Is there bills? Is there costs? And it all comes in the round, and you've got to do it at a pace where you can clean things up, protect our environment. But you've also got to do it in a way that's responsible for taxpayers and for people at home who have to pick up the tab.
Right. Dan, do you agree with that?
Well, what I think is that the scale of the challenge that we face is almost overwhelming, but at the same time, there are some real economic opportunities. The Yorkshire Post is absolutely right. There is a real opportunity here to invest in sustainable green technologies that will provide jobs for the future, well-paid jobs.
But do we need new licences for oil and gas exploration?
Well, there's always a balance to be struck in terms of keeping the lights on, but we do need to make sure that at absolute pace we are moving in the way that other countries are to invest in technologies and economic opportunities to provide highly skilled jobs in the kind of energies and producing the kind of technologies that undoubtedly we are going to need. In my own area, there's some extraordinary opportunities, but we need government actively engaged, working with mayors and with local authorities in the private sector and universities to make the most of these opportunities. Look at the energy and the focus in the United States. We need to see more of that here.
Well, we'll come on to the levels of investment that Labour is suggesting if you win power in the general election. But, Phoebe, listening to Dan Jarvis there for Labour, do you sense any difference in the approach in terms of oil and gas?
Can I come back to why I said it's an act of genocide? Because you were talking about economics, you were talking about job opportunities, and I think you're really missing the point, and that is that people are dying as a direct result of the climate crisis. And every day that emissions rise, and they will continue to rise whilst we keep licensing new fossil fuels, more people will die. There is blood on the hands of the Tory party, and they know it.
All right, well, that's quite a charge. Emily, you wanted to come in, and I'll come to you, Alex, in just a moment.
I mean, there's so much to say on this, but I would just say, firstly, that we've just been coming out of a gas supply crisis. We've had to import it from some despotic regimes, arguably. Do you want to be doing that or to be making it here in this country? Second, the Committee of Climate Change have just released a report today talking about the importance of adaptation. The UK alone cannot change the global temperature. That cannot happen. So what we need to do is be adapting to what's happening. We need to adapt to change. That's what the Committee of Climate Change is saying today in its report, and that is just as important as our transition to green energy. We need to be able to adapt.
Now, I'm going to come back to you, Phoebe, in a moment. I saw you shaking your head, obviously, at the sound of adaptation. But, Alex Salmon, you were in favour of the Cambo oil field or further exploration of it near Shetland. What do you think when you hear someone like Phoebe speaking about her generation, about the dramatic language she uses in terms of people dying if we don't stop it immediately?
Well, I admire Phoebe's commitment to the issue, but can also say I introduced the first climate change legislation in 2009, which is why Scotland, of course, in terms of its electricity supply, has more than 100% from renewables right now. And if that was the case in the rest of the UK, we'd all be in a better place. But there's so much hot air from the government. I mean, I think every new licence in the North Sea should be attached to a zero carbon commitment, and I also think that's possible. But you see, the carbon capture should be going ahead at the Acorn plant in St Fergus. You know, the government's expecting £80,000 million extra from windfall taxes in the North Sea, but they won't put £1 billion into the plant where most of North Sea gas is landed at St Fergus and Aberdeenshire. That's the amount of hypocrisy. And incidentally, it's been going on through Labour governments as well. The Miller project, which would have had Peterhead as a hydrogen station in 2007, was sabotaged by Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling. So, you know, this is hot air on carbon capture, hot carbon dioxide in carbon capture, unless you invest where the gas is landed in St Fergus in Aberdeenshire.
Matt, do you want to respond?
I think there's lots of competing priorities for the government, isn't there? We talked about all the competing priorities on expenditure. Perhaps if Scotland was spending a bit more on its NHS, they wouldn't have record waiting lists. Perhaps if they're spending more.
80 billion excess oil and gas taxes, and you won't spend £1 billion on a carbon capture plant.
But it's funding the cost of living crisis and helping people across this country pay their bills.
You're gaining 79 billion, 80 billion extra taxes, but you won't invest £1 billion in carbon capture. Why not?
In Scotland,
you won't invest £1 billion in carbon capture.
You are spending your money on certain priorities, we're spending on others. We do not want our NHS waiting list to be through the roof. We do not want our education system to be
grabbing £80 billion and you won't spend £1 billion.
All right, Dan, what about, I mean, obviously talking about previous Labour governments too, would you be able to commit to the sorts of levels of investment as in America under Joe Biden's administration?
Well, Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer and Ed Miliband have committed that the next Labour government will invest £28 billion in a green industrial plan. I saw for 4 years as the mayor the difficulties that we have at a regional level in terms of attracting investment. To give you one very practical example, I wanted to transform our bus networks. If we're serious about climate change, we've got to get people out of cars and achieve modal shift. We've just seen the government cut the active travel budget recently, which will mean that fewer people are able to cycle. I wanted to revolutionise our buses. I wanted to decarbonise the fleet. There wasn't any investment that came down from national government to help me do that. So if we're serious about addressing the massive challenges, we need to put our money where our mouth is, and that's why Rachel Reeves has committed £28 billion a year.
Right. Phoebe, you heard Alex Salmon saying that any new licence or any further exploration of oil and gas should be attached to a commitment to net zero. Would you accept that?
Any new licensing of new oil and gas is not a commitment to net zero. And I'd like to come back to what you said about adaptation, because I don't understand how you plan to adapt to climate breakdown. There were hundreds of lawyers that signed a letter to say that we will see the breakdown of law and order at 1.5 degrees of warming, which we're locked in for. When we get to 2 degrees of warming, they predict that we see 1 billion climate refugees. Just before I came on, I heard that you were talking about the refugee crisis. How do you plan to adapt to 1 billion climate refugees?
Phoebe,
why aren't we implementing the scientific solutions that we have? Why aren't we switching to renewables, which are 9 times cheaper? Why aren't we insulating British homes?
Well, let them answer. Let them answer your questions.
Why aren't we taxing big polluters and billionaires? These are no-brainer solutions.
All right, Emily, first.
The point is that there needs to be an emphasis on adaptation, because the UK alone, even if we stopped using oil and gas today, which would lead to people starving and being unable to heat their homes, even if we stopped all oil and gas today, had no carbon emissions, that would not be enough to affect change across the world and affect the global temperature. We are only responsible for a tiny slither of carbon emissions in the world. So unless you want to stop China from building more power plants, unless you want to stop India from doing the same, all of these developing countries. And let's remember, oil and gas is what's put us in this position where we have life expectancy longer, far longer than it ever used to be, where we are able to build, where we are able to have medicines, we are able to fuel our cars, have transportation, etc., etc. We obviously still need oil and gas.
Phoebe?
Well, we could be using renewables. We're an island.
We are.
Why
We're
aren't we using
transitioning,
tidal
Phoebe.
power? Why aren't we using tidal power?
Matt?
We've got the biggest offshore wind sector in the. We are leading the way in this. We're responsible for 1.5% of the world's emissions. The
We claim
UK
to be
is
global
definitely doing
leaders.
its bit. I think you need to talk to the people in China about them doing their bit, and everybody did the bit. We'll be in a much better place.
Well, let me
decarbonising faster than anybody else in the G7. We're doing a damn good job.
Phoebe, and then I'll come to you, Alex.
We claim to be global leaders. Why aren't we leading the way in decarbonisation? We're
We're
going to have to
trying.
decarbonise at some point. Why aren't we leading the way?
Well,
Why aren't we stopping
Phoebe,
oil
let me
and
come
gas
back to
today?
Alex.
When is the deadline for an end to fossil fuels?
Yeah, let me come back.
always do more.
Let me
We
come
are
back to Alex.
decarbonising faster
Let me come
than
back to
everyone.
Alex's point because she rejected, Phoebe, your suggestion of making net zero commitments alongside any further oil and gas exploration.
Well, obviously, I think we should try carbon capture in the saline aquifers of the North Sea. If it's going to work anywhere, it's going to work there. But we should certainly have to do it at St Fergus, because that's where the gas is landed. But can I just point out, we have to incentivise consumption as well. I mean, look, the price of gas and electricity in the UK over the last 2 years has been based on the international price of gas. But Scotland is 100% self-sufficient renewables. The price of wind hasn't gone up. The price of water hasn't gone up. So why are people being asked to pay electricity bills based on the international price of gas?
Emily?
Yes, I know, I would agree with that.
Right. What about the sorts of changes that people, consumers, taxpayers, households will have to make if we are going to achieve the next stage in terms of net zero? So it could be throwing out your gas boilers. It is about dumping your petrol cars. Are governments being honest about those changes, Emily?
Probably not. If you were to completely go net zero and reduce our emissions to zero, it would require getting rid of boilers, as you say, not driving cars, not having transportation in the way we currently do, not having industry in the way we currently do, getting rid of oil and gas. And let's remember that if we don't dig it out of the ground here, we're importing it from elsewhere. So that's not exactly cutting our carbon emissions. It would require dramatic change. But I think what is important is that we are seeing massive change in terms of technology. The technology is getting better and better. We're seeing electric vehicles, while they've had their hurdles, they are getting better. Things are moving in the right direction.
But too slowly, maybe. Have you not been honest enough?
Definitely too slowly. I mean, we had a budget a couple of weeks ago. I don't think there was anything in that budget with regard to home insulation. This is a massive issue. I can't understand why the government don't want to invest more resource and effort in properly insulating homes. Good for the environment, but also good for people's pockets during a cost of living crisis.
I mean, do you think people in Scotland, too, are aware of the cost of heat pumps unless you have massive government intervention?
Well, that's the point I'm making. I mean, it's cheaper to produce electricity from renewables than it has been from fossil fuels over the last 2 years. But you've got to people have to have the incentive of getting that cheap electricity to heat their homes. And the question is, why not? I mean, I'd scrap Ofgem and start again in terms of energy regulation, because what they're doing is suicidal in terms of that transition to renewable energy.
Renewables are fantastic, but of course they are intermittent, and you do need a base load that will keep our energy system reliable. It could be nuclear, which would be far greener.
We've got
than what
plenty
we've
of
got at the
technology
moment.
for that. I mean, we're just licensing the greatest pump storage station in Scotland for 50 years. You can match renewables to pump storage hydro, you can match it to batteries, you can move to the hydrogen economy. Of course there are ways to do that without saying we need to spend countless billions on nuclear power.
Phoebe, just before we let you go, what about nuclear power?
Well, it's lovely to hear some people on the panel talking some sense. If all politicians spoke like that, then we wouldn't have to be out on the streets. And I hope that it's not just talk, it's action, because the Tory party have proven that they are just talk. Last summer, they were found guilty of not meeting their legally binding net zero agreements. Yet last year, it was me who spent a month in prison. I'm not a criminal. I'm a scared kid trying to fight for my future.
All right, Phoebe Plummer, thank you for coming on Politics Live. We're going to talk about something completely different. Shelley Phelps, BBC political reporter, has been following the tragic story